Some houses just feel twisted, and you sense it the moment you step onto the land. And for one 11-year-old boy, that place was his family home, a run-down property in a New Zealand forest. But in the back garden of this house stood an abandoned stone building, its walls covered with strange markings and obscene drawings that looked less like graffiti and more like ritual. The place already had a sense of paranormal power, but when Toby was forced to sleep alone in one of the dark bunkhouses, he was plunged into the most terrifying night of his life. But the terror did not stay at the bunkhouse, because what followed would grow even more disturbing, including a genuinely chilling link to a devastating real-life double murder. Tonight, told publicly for the first time ever, one boy's haunting, one tragic real-world horror linked by a supernatural mystery that refuses to fade. And keep watching until the end, as we reveal a chilling piece of information we uncovered about the history of this very spot that implies that there were strange things walking through these woods long before Toby and his family ever set foot on the land. I'm Peter Laws, and you and I are about to walk into the fog. I receive so many emails from viewers of this channel, and I'm grateful for it. And I got one from a man from New Zealand who was finally sharing his paranormal experience after 40 years. Now, I know his real name, but he would prefer to keep that private, so I'll respect that. So we're going to call him Toby. Telling of his encounters affected Toby emotionally, but he hopes that by sharing this, he might help others not feel so alone when they too run into the inexplicable. Maybe some of you out there know exactly what that feels like. Well, his story revolves around a rather unique property that had been in his family for years. It stood in the northwest of Auckland in New Zealand, in a place called Greenhithe, which is surrounded by harbour waters and tidal creeks. Now again, I won't tell you the specific address, but I will say the street name. It's called Rame Road. These days, Rame Road in Greenhithe is a leafy, pretty suburb, but back in the 1980s when Toby lived there, the area was far more rural and isolated, with far fewer road links. The house was surrounded by a forest with a dirt track that led to a nearby beach. The property was even more remote when Toby's great-grandfather built the place. He constructed the house and the outhouses at a time before the area even had a water supply or electricity. Now, to help you get an idea of how odd this location was, you need to get your head around the layout of this property. Look at this map that I asked Toby to draw for us. The main house had a living room, a kitchen, and one bedroom. But it also had separate bunk rooms built away from the main property. Even the bathroom was separated from the main house. Even in the 1980s, Toby told me that they had no running water. The only source was a tank from which they collected water from the rain. The house and the outbuildings were mostly made of wood, apart from one. That was older than the others and was made of stone. It wasn't big, only about 3 by 4 meters. And it was mostly used to store junk. Toby can remember his grandmother's old pram for when she was a baby, sat amongst the spiderwebs in there. But what always got under Toby's skin were the walls of the stone house. They were covered in handprints, as if someone had dipped their palms and fingers into various coloured paints and just pressed their hands against the stone, or like someone had frantically crawled up and around and across those walls. I share spooky things here, so how's this for spooky? I lost my earbuds recently and I searched the house, nothing. And then suddenly an email arrived that saved the day. This video is sponsored by Raycon, and their email asked if I wanted to try their essential open earbuds with a 20% offer for my viewers. And I was like, the universe clearly wants this to happen, so I said yes. Now this is my first time ever trying open earbuds, which don't seal off your ears, they just sit outside the ear canal. So don't expect thumping bass with these. However, the reason why open earbuds are getting so popular is that you can listen to music or podcasts sounding crisp and clear without that blocked off feeling you get with in-ear buds. Listening while being aware of what's around you was really nice and safer too when you're walking the busy streets. My last buds would always drop out on runs or hit training, but these Raycons stayed in place and felt comfortable thanks to this funky little hook. And unlike my last buds, they're IPX4 waterproof, so they can handle sweat and light rain. The battery lasts 36 hours, which is longer than any walk or workout I'm gonna do. And the essential open earbuds are perfect for refreshing your routine this spring. So click on the link in the description box or go to buyraycon.com/intothefog-open to get 20% off. Thank you, Raycon, for your perfect timing and for sponsoring. But it wasn't just handprints. There were painted figures directly on these walls, and the artwork was rough and amateur. It was created with a large artist's paintbrush, it seemed, but skilled enough to know exactly what was going on. Toby described these images as lewd and sexual. He said no more than that. Now, I didn't know what that meant exactly. Did he mean that these drawings were just simply naked or something more explicit? So I asked him to describe these paintings in plain language so he could understand what he's getting at. He said that these paintings were incredibly crude and graphic drawings of many different women. In the pictures, most of the women were masturbating, while some were pulling their own breasts in a grotesque, painful fashion far beyond the physical limitations of their bodies, almost like they were made of rubber. There were some male figures too, but they never stood alone like some of the women did. The males were always pictured in various sexual positions with the females. Toby told me this. Whoever did them was no artist. It almost looked like graffiti, but also somewhat ritualistic. One image had one of the women squatting down on one of the fingers of one of the handprints. That was about the most creative. Now, the living room of the main house did have some 1960s black and white wallpaper, which also featured naked women. But the images on the stone walls were just different. They were unsettling and handmade. As you might imagine, the stone room prompted the adults of the family to joke that orgies must have taken place in this building. But the grandmother suggested that it was deeper than that. She thought that this old stone hut could have been a gathering place for local witches to carry out their rituals. I looked into newspaper reports from this area of New Zealand, and there are articles that make claims about satanic cults and witchcraft covens, not that that's the same thing, of course. But while examples aren't common, there is evidence of people in the area being genuinely scared of witchcraft. For example, I found a shocking report from the Auckland Evening Star from July 1893, where a Māori healer was alleged to have treated 200 locals for witchcraft, many of whom were children. But get this, the healing system involved pouring boiling water onto their bare bodies and then applying hot mashed potatoes to their skin. The article says, in some instances, the flesh peeled off. 50 deaths are attributed to this treatment. Now, was this story from that newspaper true or false? The paper itself wasn't sure. But the point I'm trying to make is that the phrase witchcraft or the occult was not unheard of in that area. And back in the early 1980s, this stone house with its arcane paintings and naked flesh and the weird handprints certainly looked the part of a forbidden site for secretive cult worship. But it wasn't just the walls, you see. The stone house itself had an ominous atmosphere about it. For a start, it stood in a forest not too far from the beach, and so there was plenty of wildlife in that area. But the animals, on the whole, would stay away from the stone house. Toby remarked that there was a weird silence that always hung around that place like a cloak. And those animals that did come close would react in very peculiar ways. For example, if cats ever wandered close to the stone house, they would switch personalities and go from placid to sudden aggression, hissing and arching their backs as if to protect themselves. But from what? However, the worst were the birds. They would sometimes fly close to the house, and when they did, they would just die. the family were always finding bodies of dead birds scattered in the dust around this stone house. These little birds would be lying everywhere, he told me, and it happened so frequently that Toby said he would witness sometimes the birds in the throes of death, just lying on the soil, gasping their last breaths in the shadow of that place. Even though most animals stayed away from these buildings, there was one creature that did the opposite. Wasps. There were 4 wasps' nests scattered around the property, and these large, hornet-like wasps were aggressive, and they seemed to thrive there. And the uneasy vibe of that little stone house seemed to seep outwards to the other outbuildings and the house itself. The reactions, you see, were weird from people. Sometimes Toby's mother would have people over to stay, presumably sleeping in the bunkhouses, only to be plagued with horrifying and deeply vivid nightmares. Yet the truly crazy part was when they shared their dreams over breakfast the next morning, others would turn cold and say, "I had the same dream." And what was this shared nightmare, you may be wondering? Well, they would all dream that they were being chased through the forest by some kind of bear-like creature. Toby's grandmother had this dream a lot. Water had a weird habit of evaporating more quickly on this property than usual. Toby remembers, for example, leaving a glass of milkshake out on a bench, and by the next morning it had somehow returned to dried powder. Now, I'm aware of strange water puddles appearing in paranormal cases, but the idea of rapid evaporation in the paranormal, that's kind of new to me, so let me know if you know anything about this sort of phenomenon. Well, despite the quirky layout, the ominous feelings, the nightmares, the effects of this place, Toby and his mother continued to live there. Why? Well, it was simple. They had no other option. They were struggling for money. His mum gave birth to him when she was a teenager, and his dad was no longer on the scene. Back in the 1980s, his father was either in prison or in a psych ward, he told me. Though Toby told me later that he did meet up with his dad when he was a teenager, and he discovered that his dad was interested in the occult and taught him how to use tarot cards. Despite his dad being out of the picture back in the 80s, though, there was another man around. His mother had a new boyfriend. He happened to be a gambling addict, and so the little money that the family made would tend to be blown on his bets. In other words, they had little option but to stay in one of the only things that was part of the family, that was belonging to them, the strange little house, built many years ago by the great-grandfather. Well, having a troubling feeling in a house is one thing, but what happens when the troubling becomes the all-out terrifying? Which is precisely what would happen when the uneasy atmosphere of that chose to manifest itself one terrifying night. Brace yourself for what you're about to hear. Can you remember how I said that the main house had only one bedroom, which Toby's mum and boyfriend were using? Well, of course, that meant that there was no room for Toby in the main house. This meant that every night he would have to leave his mother and head outside to the bunkhouse. At least it was the one that was nearest to the house and the one that happened to have heating and electricity. Still though, how would you feel if at 11 years old you had to sleep in a separate building from your family, like you were camping out every single night in the woods? Only you were also much closer to the strange and disturbing stone house with all those crude pictures on the wall. I asked Toby, why did the property have these detached bunk rooms? Like, why didn't the great-grandfather just build the rooms into the main house? Toby said he had absolutely no idea why. He just figured that they were a place for people to stay, for guests to have some privacy. Well, one night, Toby was lying on his bunk, listening to the hiss of the dark trees that surrounded him. Perhaps he could hear the groan of the sea on the other side of the forest. Then, amongst the familiar sounds, came a new thing. Something he could hear was stirring in the woods outside. The sound grew into a horrible, violent whine that quickly transformed to 2 hideous squeals, and he soon realized that this skin-tightening wailing was coming from 2 cats. They were fighting out there, and they were close too. Can you remember how I said that cats always became violent when they were close to the stone house? Well, that's where these two wild animals must be right now. And they were going absolutely crazy. Young Toby pulled his cover close. He'd heard cats fighting before, but this was on an entirely different level. They didn't just sound like they were fighting, they were decimating each other. But more than that, the frantic, violent energy of these cats seemed deliberate. The more he lay there, forced to listen to this violence, the more Toby began to feel that these sounds were not just happening near to him, they were happening for him. As if this horrible racket was carefully and gleefully being directed at this little boy. This fighting went on for about an hour. But that would be the least of his problems that night. Because after what seemed like an eternity, something else came. And this sound was smaller, perhaps, but closer, much closer. He listened to it. Tap, 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 tap. A chill slid down his spine as realization struck. That was the bunkhouse window, which was right above his bed. Something was outside, and that something was tapping on the window to his room. Every nerve in his body fired, but he refused to look, and so he just stared in the other direction, his mind stumbling over itself to find a rational explanation. It's a branch, he told himself. There's a branch in the breeze, it's tapping on the window. But he knew it wasn't a branch. There were no trees close enough to the window to do that. The fighting cats grew even more violent and frenzied, so unhinged that it was hard even to believe that they were cats, but almost like something pretending to be cats, something wearing their voices as it became bolder and bolder to become itself. But worst of all was the tapping sound, which went on and on, tap, 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 persistent, insistent, clear enough to notice the lack of a lower frequency to the tapping. I mean, think about it. Fingertips, if you tap them against glass, they make that lower boop. This tapping was harder and sharper. Not fingertips, fingernails. And the consistent high frequency of this implied a distance from the fingertips. In other words, these fingernails were long. His immediate thought wasn't, there's a creature out there with claws. He just kept thinking, it's a woman. There's a woman tapping on a little boy's window in the middle of the night. And if he was to finally turn to face her and look up at that window, what might he see behind the glass looking down, and what kind of eagerness might he see in her eyes? Just then, he sensed a shift in the atmosphere. The walls, the ceilings, the corners of this room, they gradually began to pick up a kind of growing blue light, as if whatever was at the window was starting to emit some sort of glow, and it was casting shadows into the room. And these shadows, he thought, as he flicked his eyes to the pools of blackness in the room, these shadows were moving. His skin began to prickle. There were things moving in those shadows inside the bunkhouse. As if in response, the blue glow increased, and he went to look at it finally. And he saw through the window a blue-grey swirl turning a little faster than a twist of smoke. But what turned his mouth dry was that the swirl had something inside it. He stared in disbelief as a figure emerged. A pitch-black silhouette of a man wearing some kind of hat. This was the moment. The hinge point of it all. Up until now, Toby was too terrified to leave his bed. Now he was too terrified to stay. He flung his covers back, and with all the vulnerability that brings, he leapt off, his bare feet slapping on the cold floor, and he raced for the door. And as he began to run, it felt like he was making no progress, like that nightmarish dream state when you're running to escape harm, but the exit is sucked away from you all the while your pursuer claws itself closer. And it was then that he got the distinct impression that whatever lurked in the shadows within the room was laughing at him. Now, like me, when you heard that detail about getting sucked back, you may be thinking that he was dreaming here. He wasn't. Because he finally made it to the door, he turned on the light, and then he rushed out of the bunkhouse across the dirt. If that was me, I'd have been terrified in that moment. The thought of stepping outside of that bunkhouse into the night, knowing that whatever tapped those fingernails may well be scrambling around the house to greet him. But no, he was so frightened now that he couldn't think of anything else but to get to the main house, to get to his mum. He burst through the front door, it slammed back with a really hard crash, and he threw himself into his mother's room to find that she was already waking up. She'd heard the main door smash back hard. As Toby rushed in, there was a lump next to his mum in the bed, and it began to stir. It was her boyfriend, dragging his sheet away and rubbing his sleepy eyes with the heel of his hand, saying stuff like, "What the hell? What the hell's going on?" Toby went to speak, but nothing came out. He was so frightened he was unable to form a word. He just reached for his mum, desperate for comfort. The boyfriend, however, was furious at being woken and made it very clear compassion was not the answer here. This kid needed to learn a lesson in maturity. No. He wouldn't be allowed to stay in their room tonight, no matter how much he wanted to, no matter how scared he was. No. He would not be permitted to grab a sheet and lie in the couch on the living room. No, that wasn't facing your fear. That wasn't being a man. The boyfriend said there was only one thing for it. To Toby's horror, he was sent back to the bunkhouse alone. He looked at his mother, desperate for her to intervene. She didn't. It's a decision she regrets to this day. And in case you get the wrong impression of her, Toby told me this. "I need to add here that I am in no way citing this as a plea for sympathy. I grew up in an extremely dysfunctional environment, but I now live a happy and fulfilling life, and my mother did protest. But it was a time in society where the man of the house was never questioned. My mother did the best she could for me, in an era when an unmarried teenage mother was absolutely frowned upon by society. It was simply how it happened." So out he went, alone, back under that night sky and the swaying trees, back amongst the dirt and the old cars and the wasps' nests and the distant waves crashing against a black shore. I can't imagine how he must have felt when he pushed that bunkhouse door open again. But when he did, at least he was relieved. It was totally silent. The window tapping had gone. The figure, the glow, all vanished. The fear was still there, though. And so he went to turn on the light because, wait, he thought, he left this light on when he'd rushed out earlier. Why was it off now? Simple. Because his mother's boyfriend had decided this lesson had to be a hard one. And so as Toby had come over here, the boyfriend had got out of bed, found the fuse box, and he had pulled the fuse for the bunkhouse lights. Not only would this help Toby man up, it would also save money on electricity. And the more money they saved, the more he could fritter away gambling. Even though the lights didn't work, the boyfriend had at least not pulled the fuse for the sockets, so at the very least, the open bar heater in that room was working, and so Toby went to switch it on. You know those types, maybe you've had them before in the past, they have like a fake glowing embers about them, really popular back in the 80s. They're warm, but they also emit this warm glow. And so Toby climbed into bed and lay in the soft, warm light of that heater, dreading that at any minute the fingernails above him were going to come scratching and scraping at the pain again. that's not what happened. He saw something else instead. Lying rigid in the bed, in what he told me was silent terror, Toby noticed a movement on top of the little bar heater. Confused, he squinted through the gloom, and that's when he saw it. A small shape, no bigger than a doll, was shifting and twitching on the top of the heater. And as his eyes adjusted, the shape became clearer, and it was something far worse than a trick of the light. A small figure was moving with purpose, jerking and prancing and stamping out some kind of frantic, soundless jig as if it were performing for him alone, and coldness flooded his veins. What was this thing? He still had no idea, but the only word he could think of to describe it to me accurately was an imp. A gleeful imp taunting him in the darkness. I appreciate how insane this is all sounding, but what would you do if you saw something that freakish in your room tonight? How would your brain cope? How would you file it away? Toby lay frozen in the bed, scarcely daring to breathe, and this time he was too terrified to pull back the cover and run, especially when he just faces Mum's boyfriend again, so he was forced to stay there, wide-eyed and rigid, while this thing danced on. And the imp seemed to come and go throughout the night until the welcome greyness of morning finally crept through the room, and whatever had taunted him was gone. And only then did he dare to pull back the covers and scramble like a wild animal back to his house, and he burst through the door again, babbling to his mother about what had happened, but you've guessed it, the boyfriend was still having none of it. He was sharp and dismissive, saying he should shut up about these stupid stories about ghosts and creatures and swirls and fingernails. And so after the most terrifying night of his life, Toby took all of his fear, he buried it inside himself. And yet, despite the warnings to speak no more of strange things, the strange things were not finished with Toby. Whether he named them or not, they found their way back to the forest house. Not in the same way exactly, but it was disturbing nonetheless. Toby told me that after that night, his mother's boyfriend began to change in that house. Not dramatically, not in ways you could easily explain, just weird, disquieting differences. Listen to this detail. He said this almost like a throwaway comment, and it made me shiver. Toby said he would sometimes wake in the night and he would find that the boyfriend, his mum's boyfriend, was up too, but only the boyfriend would be perched on the property's windowsills, and he would be crouching there like a bird in the silence, and he'd be staring up at the moon, almost like he was in conversation with it. But then another event happened around the time of that terrifying night. And again, Toby almost mentioned this to me in passing, but I find it so shocking and so intriguing that I wanted to dig more deeply into it. And what I found out is really, really startling and chilling, because it involves a real life murder. It was Saturday, the 5th of May, 1984. Toby was sitting in his mother's car when, without warning, he was hit with a sudden compulsion. He became insistent, desperate really, demanding that his mother take the car and drive them directly to a particular bridge, to Auckland Harbour Bridge. He kept saying, Mum, we've got to go there now, drive, go. His mother was, confused. She asked him, why on earth are you so desperate to go to Auckland Harbour Bridge? Because, he said, something bad is going to happen on that bridge. We've got to get there, Mum. Now, if, like me, you were to look at the maps of Greenhithe today, a lot of highways have been put in, so it takes around 14 minutes to get from Toby's house to the Auckland Harbour Bridge. But back in the 1980s, the route was not straightforward. The local route options were very limited. Lots of winding back roads, which meant that an impromptu trip to Auckland Harbour Bridge that day would have taken about 40 minutes there and 40 minutes back. I ask you, if you had a kid who randomly asked this one day, would you take them on at least an 80-minute journey on a whim? And if you said yes, is that because you could afford the petrol money? Remember, money was tight for this family. The mother said, no, we're not going to the bridge. Just because you think something bad's going to happen there, we're not going. And the matter was dropped. At around the same time, another car was making its way to Auckland Harbour Bridge. Inside it sat a 31-year-old man called Philip Colin Money. He was driving with his 2 young children in the car. Vanessa Helen Money was 5 years old, while Hayden Ian Money was 3.5. They lived in Marangi Bay, which is only about 9 miles from Toby's house in Greenhithe. But right now, Philip Money was driving to the same place that Toby wanted to go to. And to the rest of the world, it was an ordinary bridge crossing that day. The traffic flowed. The harbour ran deep and wide. Nothing from the outside suggested that anything was wrong, but inside Philip Money's car, something had already begun to fracture and break. He made his way in his car over the bridge, high above the water, and then he pulled the car over near the high centre of the crossing. I checked into the weather that day. It was fairly normal, slightly chilly, bit of a wind coming over across the roadway. And he got out. Engines thundered past as Philip Money walked around the car. Witnesses would later report that they saw him step out of the car and then open the other car door, and he took out each child in turn. What followed happened quickly, and some viewers might find this part disturbing. We don't know the order. We just know Philip Money took each of his children one at a time, and he threw them. He threw them off Auckland Harbour Bridge. This bridge sits roughly 64 metres above the water. A fall from that height is extremely dangerous, often fatal, especially for a small child. But he still lifted his son and lifted his daughter and just flung them over the side. Their small bodies plunged about 18 stories into the vast, dark water below, and when it was done, Philip Money himself climbed up onto the barrier and he jumped in after them. Someone raised the alarm. I assume it was one of the horrified drivers as they passed by, not expecting they were collecting up a few months of sleepless nights. And soon rescue boats were deployed. They rushed to the scene in a frantic rescue attempt, and it was partially successful. Philip Money was pulled out of the harbour. Somehow he had survived. His 3.5-year-old son Hayden was recovered soon after, but tragically he did not make it. As for 5-year-old Vanessa, her body was never found. In the months that followed, doctors and psychiatrists would testify that Philip Money had been suffering from a severe schizophrenic illness at the time of the killings. And in the months leading up to that day, Money even went through a psychotic phase, telling his aunt that he was Jesus Christ and that his son Hayden was the new Messiah. But by May 5th, 1984, he came to believe that the world was too dangerous for his children to grow up in. He believed he was protecting them from the darkness of life by murdering them. He was unemployed at the time, 31 years old. Philip Money hobbled into court on crutches and was declared to be legally insane at the time of the killings. He would later die on the 4th of September 2006. He was 53. In the years since that tragedy, some locals claim the bridge has never really shook off its shadow. Not only with those deaths, but other people have died on the bridge, including a man who was said to have drowned in those waters from falling from it, and from time to time people report seeing a dark, human-shaped figure beneath the harbour bridge. A silhouette lingering near the concrete supports. Some have seen a figure hovering low over the water at dusk or dawn, stubbornly visible even in the glare of passing headlights. But back on that Saturday in May 1983, thoughts were not on the supernatural, but on the depressingly physical. And those who heard of this double killing shuddered at the thought of it. Especially one particular boy elsewhere in Auckland and his mother. Why did Toby feel the sudden urge to go to that specific bridge on that very day when Money felt a similar urge, only for very different reasons? It's an element to this case that I find perplexing and disturbing. But it appears that for a moment at least, Toby encountered a very bad omen. Remember that. Well, back in Greenhithe, things were about to change, because when his grandmother heard about this night in the bunkhouse that he'd had, it was the last straw. She decided that the time had come to sell this place and get out of there. Now, was it because of the paranormal element? I'd be exaggerating if I said that was it. It might be part of it, but sadly his grandmother's no longer around to tell us, so we can't assume that. But there was also pressure from surrounding developers. They were trying to gentrify the area, which is why it looks so leafy and sweet today, to make it a pleasant suburb. So she decided to sell up, and the family moved away from the bunkhouses and the bathhouses and the stone house with its strange pictures. The place was torn down, and new houses were built in the late 1980s. And I found this interesting. You know how people will talk about old houses they lived in with a sense of nostalgia and affection? I do this. I think about old houses I've lived in like that. Toby told me that even now, nobody in his family ever talks about the forest house. Like it's a place best forgotten. Does that mean, therefore, that Toby's paranormal experiences were over now that he was gone? Well, no. Because there are two further incidents we cannot ignore. A few years after the bunkhouse night, after they had moved away, Toby was swimming in a local river with friends. He and his pals would sometimes swim towards the riverboats. And being reckless boys as they were in that summer, they'd get up and climb into the boats, steal the beer, swimming away from there, all wearing their jeans, by the way, at the time, bogging them down with that. On that day, however, something went wrong. Toby was swimming in the river when he felt something beneath the surface, a quiet, steady tug at his legs. It was the undertow. That river had a notorious underwater channel that had to be avoided, but right now it had him. And to his horror, he felt himself being sucked under the surface of the river, and his face and head suddenly plunged beneath the cold water, and he fought hard to break back up again, but the current was so strong and it refused to let him go. And after an exhausting time of thrashing for his life, he soon came to the realization that there was very little he could do, and that the only real option he had was to stop fighting it and to let the river drag him like a rag doll wherever it wanted. And in that letting go, he knew full well that these might be the final seconds of his life. And it was then, in that strange, breathless surrender, that he saw it. Something was forming deep in the water nearby. A slow, turning glow. He was under the water, so it was hazy, of course, but it looked like a deep blue spiral, just like the one he had seen at the bunkhouse window that night. And right now it was twisting and folding in on itself, and within it, just as before, a shape began to gather, a figure emerging from the shifting light. He couldn't be sure, it was so murky down there, but it didn't feel like a man's figure. It looked like a woman, the shape of a woman. Unlike before, there was no trace of menace or cold dread. Instead, there was peace. And when describing it later to me, Toby would settle on a single word to describe this, an unexpected one. He said it felt beautiful. The water no longer felt like an enemy. The panic drained away, and it was replaced by an eerie stillness. But then this presence began to move. It didn't seize him, didn't drag him, and yet he felt himself gradually drifting with this figure, gently moving through the dark water on an unseen current that had now shifted and chosen a different path for him than before. The blue swirl turned, the figure gliding with it, and Toby felt his body follow. He said to me, "I just remember looking at it as it floated to the surface with me. And then his head finally broke through the surface. He heaved in the air as the world crashed all at once back into his life. The slap of water, the sharp cry of voices, the blinding brightness of the sky above. He dragged breath after ragged breath into his burning lungs. And on the shore he could just about make out his friends. And they stood there frozen, staring at him in stunned disbelief. Later they would tell him how certain they were that he was not coming back, because by their reckoning, Toby had been under the water far longer than any breath could last, and yet he had survived. Or is it more appropriate to say he was saved? There is one more paranormal incident since the bunkhouse that we need to discuss. Only this one was not beautiful like the woman in the lake. Toby was in his late teens at this point, and he was living in a typical young person's flat in central Auckland. And one night he woke up suddenly in the dark, and he just happened to look across at a small table that was by his bed, which is where he saw a figure. It was hunched over, heavy and still, as though it had been waiting for him to wake up. At first it was only a shape in the gloom, but as his eyes adjusted to the light, the outline sharpened, and a cold recognition crept in. This wasn't a person. It was some kind of creature. The thing had the legs of a man, yet above them rose a broad, hulking body, thick and animal-like. And where a human face should have been, there was the unmistakable head of some kind of hound glaring at him. It did nothing, said nothing. It just watched him from across the table. And strangely, Toby felt less terror than you may have expected. In fact, it bordered on a slight, bold irritation at whatever this thing was stepping into his life. And as he stared back at this Dogman, the figure began to lose its shape, and it thinned into the shadows until, little by little, it was gone. Was this a waking dream? Perhaps. Or was it a fleeting glimpse of the same nameless presence that haunted the old place? Can you remember how people who stayed in the bunkhouse would have the same dream as each other, of being chased through the forest by something that looked like a bear? Toby told me that despite having the legs of a man and the head of a dog, the thing had this large furry bulk of a body which he said mostly looked like a bear. But soon that staring figure had faded, and that was the last time he ever had any sort of encounter with the paranormal. And so we're left with a series of incidents, but two core encounters. One filled with dread in a terrifying night in a bunkhouse. The other marked by a strange, mysterious beauty in the murky depths of a rushing river. And somewhere in between those two incidents, connecting them perhaps, a bridge, where Toby felt inexplicably drawn, just as a father was drawn, albeit for very different reasons. There may be rational explanations for all of these things. For example, he admits that he'd been drinking beer on the day of the river incident. He also knows and has read about how oxygen deprivation can trigger hallucinations, or that a drowning brain can conjure shapes and lights, even voices. Maybe the swirl in the lake was nothing more than that, something from his mind. And yet, the more I hear your stories, the more I'm coming to be convinced that there are some things we cannot dismiss rationally. And when you hear what I discovered next, maybe you might wonder if something really does stalk the land where Toby used to live. Listen to this. After Toby told me his story, I dived into the research for it, looking into the history, the background, the area, and I started to go on various Facebook groups asking questions about the area of Greenhithe in New Zealand. I wanted to know if people could tell me about the history of the place. I don't just want to get my stuff from Wikipedia, it's good to know from the actual people who live there. Dr. Rod Fee got in touch and he shared some historical documents with me, one of which was a fascinating little history of Greenhithe by R.E. King. Now, ironically, this local book was written in the very year that Toby had his experience in the Bunkhouse, 1984. It's not a paranormal history book, and the information in there is about the land, about the people who lived there. But buried amongst all of the general history, there was one detail that really got my attention. Local tradition records the original Māori names for certain locations in the Greenhithe area. Māori, by the way, if you don't know, are the indigenous Polynesian people of New Zealand. Well, this book lists the Māori names used to describe certain Greenhithe areas in the past, and they mean fairly innocuous things. The river bend, the sharp hill, the scented shrub. Just traditional ways of describing a location in Greenhithe for the Māori people, fair enough. The only one that stood out to me as odd was called Te Whare mo e Natnu, which translates as the house where one talks in their sleep. Early writers recorded this as an ominous sign, even linking it to the idea of a bad omen. It said that in the history book. In other words, this area of Greenhithe was not described by its physical characteristics like the others, but by the fact that for some reason, for the Maori people, they seemed to have uneasy nights whenever they were in this part of Greenhithe. And what really got my attention was the area they were talking about. Greenhithe is a decent-sized suburb. It covers about 8 square miles of land. Yet the records say that this place of sleepless nights was on the south headland of Lucas Creek. So I checked the maps. Today, it doesn't look like there's an inlet of water near Rame Road, but there is a stretch of greenery and sand that looks like it could have been an inlet in the past. So I looked up some of the older maps, and sure enough, Lucas Creek did indeed stretch down into the north corner of Greenhithe. And R.E. King, the author of this history book, says that the place of sleep talking or sleep whispering was the most southerly part of that creek, which today is within the same small pocket of land on which Rame Road stands, where this happened. And listen to what I'm saying. I'm not just saying on the same street. This history book specifically says it's on the same part of the street. Can you hear what I'm saying here? R.E. King, not writing a book about the paranormal, was able to say that out of all of the places of Greenhithe, the location that the Maori people remembered for troubled sleeps, uneasy nights, strange nocturnal disturbances, maybe even bad omens, because it uses that phrase, is the same specific pocket of land where Toby and his family would later speak of shared nightmares, shadowy presences, and bad omens on an Auckland bridge. Maybe there really was something on that land long before Toby lived there, long before his grandfather built the place, long before the strange little stone house was built, and long before the Maori found their home there. And if something did walk that haunted land, be it human or inhuman, is it still there today? If you live in that area of Greenhithe, particularly around Rame Road, perhaps you could get in touch. Though, again, and I've said this in other episodes when a specific location is mentioned, please remember that the house itself was torn down and new buildings have been built there. And be respectful of the fact that this is a residential street. It's why I haven't given the specific house number here. But it's pretty fascinating, if you ask me, and I'd love to get out more information if possible. Toby doesn't claim to believe in God or the devil, though sometimes he says he is potentially open to the idea of angels and demons. After all, what if that's precisely what he encountered in the darkness of the forest and the darkness of the lake. He doesn't let these things bother him too much. And yet he did admit that when he finally shared this story with me, the emotion of it all hit him way harder than he expected. He wrote, "I find myself crying as I write this. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to tell a story that I have never told before." Maybe that's what we're left with tonight. The truth is that most of us move through ordinary days, crossing roads and bridges and swimming in rivers and sleeping in quiet rooms, never imagining how thin the boundary can be between the familiar world and whatever might be standing just beyond it. That may contain things that even watch us as we sleep and watch us as we drown. Makes you wonder, do you ever have nightmares? Have you always assumed that you are dreaming of fictional beings, products of your imagination, firing off random images and stories into your head at night? What if they're not random? What if your dreams are reflecting something that is physically outside of you, even in the same room as you, watching you as you dream those dreams, and reaching out? And in a world of angels and demons, perhaps the only question to ask is this: what kind of hand is reaching through the darkness to touch you? I'm Peter Laws, and you've been watching Into the Fog. Good night.